Yeah, thank you very much for the good papers. I have two questions. One on the construction industry. If I see the construction industry in other countries, then I find that nearly, not everywhere, but in many countries where collective bargaining is weak, multi-employer bargaining survived in the construction industry. In UK, for example, which is surprising, in Hungary, for example. And the question is why? Why is that? And my interpretation is there are employers' interest in collective bargaining. And these are, I think, Dale, you said sharing a labor force is important, but sharing a labor force is not sufficient. It must be a skilled labor force, because the other labor force can be easily replaced. And also, I think what is very important, the construction workers, the skilled construction workers are highly skilled. They are flexible. They know what to do in a changing environment. So they have alternatives in the labor market. If they are treated very badly, they just leave the sector. This is happening in Germany. We are just doing a study on roofers, and 50 to 60% of the skilled roofers are leaving the industry before they are getting 35 years old. So they have alternatives. I think these things we have to understand. And the details are very different across countries, because you told us a very US story. Because, you have social funds in many European countries, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, where the employers, based on extended collective agreements, pay up to 20% of the gross hourly wage to a fund for vacation pay, for training levies, etc. And there's a high interest of employers in doing this. My second question is to multi-employer workplaces. I'm not so sure what you are looking at. I mean, if you have in countries where you have nearly, let's say, 100% of coverage by collective agreement, this is not so much a problem, because everybody is paid to a collective agreement, like in Sweden or Belgium. But if you have fragmented collective bargaining, then it becomes a problem. And then it's the question, what is the solution? I'm not so sure about the solution. The best solution would be 100% coverage, which is difficult to get. But other solutions are the airport in San Francisco with an airport agreement, things like that. But what are you looking at? I haven't really understood.
Thanks so much, John Peters from Laurentian University. Really great presentations, and I really think that, sort of thinking about how construction works and how unions have been able to use bargaining by unionizing and certifying across occupations is a sort of an interesting thing. But then also thinking about what is the actual history about how is it that you got employers, even in the United States, to both first initially buy into a multi-employer agreement, but then now continuing to use it. And I think Gerhard's quite right. It's a skilled labor question, right, in many ways. But you can still look at the numbers of people who are coming from Central America, and I could bet dollars to donuts there's more than enough skilled labor that's coming up in terms of migration that could be used by, and especially in, say, residential. But I'm interesting that it's not being used in bigger kinds of projects, whether commercial or in other kinds of skilled kinds of work. But I guess the question, I think, is David Weil's question, is how is there a way of counting this? Certainly, we can count this. We can see multi-employer bargaining in construction, and we could probably be able to say, okay, it's happening in X number of workplaces. But I'm wondering, what about, is there any way that we can track either in North America or the United States or in Europe about what happens in, say, transport, which seems to be the big area that's happening in both Europe, but also here in Canada as well, or textiles, which is what Nick is taking place. Other kinds of service work, which David Weil talks about, private telecommunications, right? Is there any way, in some cases, unions are going to be the ones who are going to be able to find this strictly on a case-by-case basis, but I'm wondering, have you been able to find other ways to be able to track this? Because if the sort of the big globalization critique is that you're seeing multi-employer and fragmentation of work, and if you're seeing Amazon, being registered in 100 different places, and there's no employer, and then suddenly you're hiring workers in different countries, and there's no way to actually enforce that, well, then suddenly that multi-employer bargaining relationship is very, very important, that you actually have to be able to organize those workplaces, not only in one spot, but across multiple countries or across regions. So the question about how to track this and how to think about it, I guess I'm wondering where you're at in that, or what sort of other resources might be available for this to be able to think about this and be able to capture it.
One last question, and presenter will answer. It's over there.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. You focus very much on the multi-employer nature of your analysis, but again, these are also, as you've already hinted at, multi-union organizations as well that are at play with trades councils that negotiate as individual unions, but do talk to each other once in a while about how to negotiate these frameworks. But they also, in the Canadian case anyway, maybe less in the U.S., these unions don't always get along, right? There's a progressive union, competitive unionism among them. LIUNA versus the carpenters versus the electricians versus, in Canada, we have the Christian Labor Association that contest this sector. And I'm just wondering what that plays into your analysis when you have multi-unions at play with these associations and what it means for success or failure.
A couple thoughts. Those were, let's say that they were questions, but they were also statements, which was a little challenging. And one thing that's come up here, and we kind of danced around, was, you're saying, well, is this union bargaining? We seem to have coalitions of unions, and it really depends in the United States. So, for example, we have a type of agreement which is called a project labor agreement, or now a community benefit agreement. And the purpose of this is, let us suppose that we have a school board, like the Los Angeles School Board, or an airport, which wants to get more balance out of its construction investment, or a port in San Francisco. So what's going to happen, what can happen, is they can essentially sit down with the building trades as representatives and bargain an agreement which will have, agree that this will be a union, or, will have union standards, but in turn, like the Port of San Francisco has a rather extensive community element, which is bringing people from low-income zip codes into the apprenticeship program, having a combined building trades and community oversight board, which looks at that as a way of moving people from, disadvantaged positions into what turn into, very solid middle-class jobs. So that's one of the things that's done in terms of cross-trade, because that has to be across, across different trades. So all the trades have to sit down through a central labor council and come to an agreement. So these are fairly common at this point. I will agree with Gerhard is that a key part of this is the skill and the training component. It isn't just sharing a workforce. I mean, in a certain sense, they do that in residential. Workers just move from one employer to another. But they're sharing a workforce that has been jointly trained to very high standards, and that makes that workforce very valuable to employers. In the United States, one of the things that shows up is that a person with their journeyman card can read industrial blueprints. And that's not typical for American construction workers. In fact, basically, the foreman, who's a union member, can point to this area, take 3 or 4 people, say, this is what needs to be done, you go do it. So there's a very light management role in union construction. I think that's what employers value.
I'm glad you asked about what kind of data or or how are we sort of tracking this? And I think the short answer is that we're not very well. And I can only speak, I think, maybe from personal experience working with state regulatory government, is that I think part of the reason is that we also have these institutional kinds of limitations in our data structures and in our regulation, where we don't have the ability to sort of network and figure out what's the product that's being produced and who's engaged in this product, in this production-based kind of organization. And so I think that speaks to some of the things that Weil was saying, that we really have to understand that product side of things, the value chain, and how that, part of the problem is also this kind of deregulated, or not well, in many cases deregulated, but fraction kind of regulatory structure as well. So, for instance, in Washington State, we may have people coming in from Oregon or Idaho, and they may or may not feel as though they have protections. It depends on the kind of laws, whether they're safety and health laws that they're complying with or not complying with, and who has the responsibility for that. So I think the best we can probably do is to, again, as you mentioned, maybe through the unions, finding out what kind of projects are going on. There's some limited places where you might be able to kind of follow up and find out who was on those projects and what the experience was. But with construction, everything moves so quickly, it's sort of hard to figure out exactly how you would do that. So we have not solved that problem, but if you have suggestions, we're willing to hear them. So
I was going to say, in terms of determining where there are joint benefit funds, that's pretty straightforward. The DOL has complete lists of that, so it'd be very possible, because they'll be listed as joint benefit funds, to figure out where you have these employer associations. There are probably some other ways through most trades you could get at that.
but that's just the union side.
Well, that's also the employer side.
Yeah,
These are
true.
joint funds, and so if you know one side, you know who the other people are. So it's a question of what you want to do with that information.
If I can add something. As far as construction is concerned, here we have this the regime that I just presented allows for tracking everything that's going on in the industry, because every working hour has to be declared. So every employer has to declare every single hour that is done by a worker anywhere in the province on the work site. So the Construction Commission can track down what every single one of these 150,000 workers is doing and getting in terms of wages and benefits every year. The problem is getting access to this data.
Yeah, all right.
Because they're not that transparent anymore. But I mean, we have them.
Well,
But in other industries, I think
yeah, I
it's
mean,
impossible
there's
even
true in
here.
the States too. You could follow permits and see, follow those and try to track, they can do some kind of randomized sort of tracking of those permits to figure out who's involved in those projects. But it's kind of the timing of going to, you really do want to get some buy-in from the employers and the owners to try to be able to study it, basically, because it's not going to be all recorded in a nice, lovely video for you to watch, usually. So sometimes there are nice videos out there, but that's one possibility. I know that's how OSHA tracks their, the Safety and Health Administration tracks their enforcement, is to try to get lists of permits, and then hopefully when they go to the job site, they know who's going to be there and who's responsible for what. But it's a little bit fragmented. A solidarity issue, I think.
I want to just to go back to the point of Gerardo, which is in fact very important. Well, first of all, as said, this was a kind of attempt to see whether something can be created around multi-employer workplaces, and the idea is to as said, I mean, to capture these kind of challenges that labor workers particularly they are confronted with when they in fact are dealing with this fragmentation issue. Yeah. Now, of course, I mean, it was just a sort of situation that we talked about construction now, but it was not meant to be only construction. But we can think, in fact, in terms of transport, in terms of digital platforms, in terms of whatever, logistics, for example. I mean, all these kind of services as well. And in fact, it is what, so going back to your point, it is about this fragmentation also in collective agreements, de facto. Because when it is about, and we know that we have a lot of research done, now I look from a European perspective, but also, you know, Anglo-Saxon or American United States perspective on outsourcing, on, you know, forms of supply chain and so forth and so forth. I mean, we didn't have I think I didn't click, there was a line of, kind of a list of studies. And so, but the question is that we see nowadays more and more that, you know, companies and employers particularly, they use these kind of strategies to outsource and to, you know, fragment more and more. And this is becoming really absolute in terms of when we look at self-employment. I mean, you see really that's a competition across workers. Now, what we would like to, and that is the challenge we have, and that is really about, you know, clustering work, also research done also by other people. Try to look also, for example, also in the automobile industry. We know, well, I remember myself in the 90s doing the work on this kind of coordination. Actually, was a multi-employer workplaces in Fiat with the all suppliers applying the same collective agreements in a particular region, which was Melfi in the south of Italy. So we are in fact looking at that sort of solutions. You know, what can be done to coordinate bargaining, to create centralized structure of collective bargaining in order to avoid that in fact people are put one against the other, to avoid that people are, in most of the situation, also pushed to engage in unpaid work in order to access paid work, for example. And that is in fact the kind of you know, idea we have, and we thought, well, let's try to launch it as an opportunity. I think there is a lot of research out there, already done, but mostly also probably can be done in the future, which can help us understanding all this. And this has, in fact, a lot of implication, I think, also particularly for solidarity. Because I don't know, but I have the impression that, you know, the kind of organic solidarity effect that Lucan was talking about, which was constructed around the kind of way, the kind of system, traditional system of production, now is probably under threat, doesn't exist anymore. So what kind of solidarity can be created? Now, we did also some work on that with Judy Dolagast and Nathan Lilly, but nevertheless, I think that there might be also a possibility really to go further and to research these kind of things and think about possibility to recreate those structures. I think what Jill Robert in one of the seminars said, we need to make employers back responsible, and I think this came very much into line this morning in the plenary. So how do we do that? I mean, what kind of structure, what kind of strategies can we think about?
Just add a little thing to that too, I think, is that you don't necessarily have solidarity on multi-employer plans themselves. I think that you know, some more industrial or organized kind of unions really want the employer just to do it all, or for the state to do it. Whereas the building trades have often been like, well, we do this ourselves, so why don't you try to do that? And of course, the law is limiting them from doing that. But there's that kind of, it's a risk to go to a multi-employer kind of arrangement because, you know, of all the things I mentioned. And it takes an enormous amount of extra work, financial capital, and trust. But there could also be benefits in that you can extend these kinds of arrangements to workers working for employers who find that demand, you know, those skills to be most helpful. And so that's something I've been always wondering too, is do these multi-employer kind of plans, do they really only apply to skilled workers or not? And that's, do we call residential construction workers skilled? Well,
Call it whatever you want.
yeah, right. I mean, or multi, residents or.
I guess, Heather, what I would say is that to some degree, I think we're kind of headed off into the weeds right now. As I said, where we find multi-employer plans in the U.S., it was basically, they predated the benefit side of it, and they arose out of small employers' desire to avoid being whipsawed by powerful unions. And so what happens is they form employer associations, and then in 1947 we get the Taft-Hartley Act, and everyone wakes up and says, there's some real advantages that we can work with this. But if you have a single big employer, GM is never going to say, let's get together with Ford and set up. It makes no sense for them. So I think that some of the precursors are, you need a bunch of small employers who are both under pressure and at the same time can see some advantages arising out of this.
I'm afraid we have to leave for 3:50 and it's 3:49, so maybe
Hopefully
we
can
could continue
some-
in the hall.
Yeah, that
So
would be
thanks
good.
to all the presenter.
Yeah.